Hello, welcome to another video. This video will discuss thesis and thesis statements, specifically to help you with your essays number 2 and number 3 when we get to them. Essay number 2 being the rhetorical analysis, your thesis will be based on your analysis of your text and how that text is persuading that audience, okay? So what I have here is from an old textbook that I used to use called Write Analytically, but I think it gives some good ideas and information about how to form a thesis statement based on your analysis. This sheet is up on the Readings tab on Blackboard, so if you want to go back to it and look at it yourself, that, and I'm also going to discuss a PowerPoint at the end of this video that will also be under the Readings tab on Blackboard, so you can see both pieces of information on Blackboard. So to analyze something is to ask what something means. And so usually when you're thinking critically or analyzing something, you're breaking it down into its smaller parts, and you're not necessarily focusing on the what, but the hows and the whys. So how something does what it does, or why it is what it is. So instead of saying, this essay is about or this text is about gun control or something else, you think, why is it doing that? And how is it being used to persuade an audience to think or feel that way? So you really want to ask a lot of how, what questions and why questions. The thesis statement is an analysis paper. In an analysis paper, like you're writing for essay number 2, should be asking those how and why questions. And a strong thesis makes a claim about the subject that needs proving. So it provides the writer and the reader with clear focused lens throughout which to view the subject. A weak thesis either makes no claim or is an assertion that does not need proving. So you really want to form a thesis that is provable, that is solvable, but not necessarily one that if a reader reads it, there is not going to be any back and forth, any way for the reader to engage with it. It shouldn't necessarily just be like a statement of fact. The thesis is not a statement of fact. If your thesis is a fact, then that's not a claim. A claim is something that is provable, that you're going to support and prove throughout the rest of your paper. Fuzzy lens, they'll not help the writer, will be guided, or the reader be guided to a better understanding. So you want it to be clear and specific. And by specific is as extremely specific as you can possibly make it with your language. Most weaker thesis statements suffer because they are overly broad, and the PowerPoint I'm going to talk about later in this video ideally will help kind of break that down a little bit more. It's not necessarily, this worksheet is saying that the grammar is often an indication of why they don't help the writer to bring the subject into clear focus, but also it's more just vagueness. So down here they have an example. The weak thesis is the economic situation is bad. And if I break this down, the word bad itself doesn't really say much. Okay, I don't know what bad means. Is pretty weak as well. I don't know what that, specifically talking about, and what exactly are they referring to when they say the economic situation. So if I read this sentence, the economic situation is bad, I really don't know what they're referring to. I don't know what they're talking about. So it's a really weak thesis because I'm not sure what they're talking about. Down here they have more specific language, a revision of this sentence. So instead of saying the economic situation is bad, they could say the tax policies of the current administration, so a specific idea, not just economic situation, but tax policies, threaten to reduce the tax burden on the middle class, so this is replacing is, and by sacrificing education and healthcare programs for everyone, and that's replacing bad, so it's much more specific. And the best way to remedy the problem of overgeneralization is to move towards specificity in word choice. And so when you're doing that, you can ask yourself, what are you actually trying to say? So as a writer, a lot of times when I sit down with a student in their essay and I don't know what something means, I really just ask them, what are you trying to say? And they repeat back to me what they mean, and I write it down, and I'm not writing the paper for them. I'm literally just writing what they spoke out loud. And so a lot of times, if you are somebody who talks about their ideas more and has trouble getting them on paper, You might try and reading it to somebody else and having them copy what you write. You might try recording yourself into a tape recorder and then listening back and then copying it down. There are a few different ways that you could do that, or just talk and then write at the same time. There are some other examples down here in the context of an essay, and you can look at those too, but definitely analyzing the how and why. And another thing about thesis statements is that you want to support them for the rest of your paper. And so a lot of times when I'm reading a paper in English 101 or English 102, I'll have a student, if they do set up their thesis, they work really well in their introduction, and they build up to that thesis. Because your introduction, one way to write a good introduction is to go from like kind of broad to specific, meaning you want to provide context for your reader and lead and build up to that thesis. Your thesis does not have to be at the end of your first paragraph. It can be, but it doesn't have to be. It also doesn't have to be only one sentence, because it can be sometimes difficult to do that. But generally, you want it somewhere in the beginning of your paper. So if the longer your paper is, the more room you have. So if you're writing like a 6-page paper, you might have a little more room for that thesis to be on the second page, maybe. If you're writing like only a 2-page paper, you want that kind of a little bit early on the first page because you have less room to build upon that and support that. But I like to think of a thesis also as like a road trip, or an essay as a road trip. If you were going to St. Louis to New York, for example, if you were driving there, you would put on your Google Maps or your Waze or something to tell you how to get there. And that would be kind of an example of an essay. It takes you everywhere you say you're going to go. Sometimes I'll read essays and they start off in a specific direction and then they veer off and talk about something else. So imagine if you started on this road trip and you had Google Maps up and it told you follow this interstate from St. Louis to New York, and then halfway through you veered off and you started going towards Florida. Well, that doesn't really make any sense. Sometimes I read essays and halfway through, or even in the second paragraph or the third paragraph, they start discussing something different. And as a reader, I have no idea how they reach that. So really wanting to think about, okay, here's my thesis. Now, how is everything else in my paper relevant to what I'm talking about here? How is any of this relevant? So if you're in your your rhetorical analysis essay, if your thesis deals with emotion, that pathos, if you're only focusing on analyzing how your text is persuading an audience in pathos, your entire rest of your paper should support that. Okay, if you want to broaden it up, you can analyze it. What are the connections between pathos and logos, or pathos and ethos, or all three? Don't list them out. Don't write a 5-paragraph essay, but make those connections. I kind of talked about in that rhetorical analysis videos, and analyze them some more. So making sure you're doing that as well. In terms of PowerPoint, I have this PowerPoint is vague to specific thesis statements. And I made this in a previous semester, and I haven't read all your papers yet, so this might not be true. But I have problems with essay number 2, and last semester when I made this, a lot of the problems that I saw were extremely similar throughout all of my classes. So I want to kind of give a heed warning before you write your papers, because I do think it's important to think and be conscious of some of the problems that might come up and that I oftentimes see with the second paper. So using the word you and talking directly to the reader, this can be extremely awkward. Doesn't mean the word you is completely forbidden forever, but a lot of times I'll read a sentence or like several sentences and they make assumptions about what the reader is saying, or they are talking directly to your reader. But what if that assumption is wrong? And what if you're assuming something about your reader that isn't true? Then they're going to go forward with a false assumption and potentially feel alienated. So kind of avoid using that word you if possible. I see a lot of overusing questions. So the point of maybe a thesis question that I've talked about in the past is to answer that question. And so, and like I just talked about, how and why, asking how and why questions, ideally answering them. So analysis is a lot of asking questions, but in answering it. So as you're brainstorming, you're trying to figure out what exactly you're trying to say, so you're asking lots of questions. By your final draft, you should have answered them, and I should see a clear thought process. You should know what you're saying. But you have to think and ask questions in order to reach that point. But in your final draft, you should delete your questions and after you answered them. So sometimes if you're writing, you might have to actually write that question, and then actually answer that question, delete the question. Vague language, like I just talked about. I hate the word thing. God, you probably have, if I commented on it before in a previous essay, I might have done that too. If the word thing, like, literally could be in 5 times in a sentence and mean something different each one. So get rid of the word thing and specify what you mean. I just talked about the words good and bad, but those are just 3 examples. Be specific with your language. Avoid vague words. Sometimes it's unclear how information supports the thesis. I just talked about that a little bit. You should have everything relevant through your essay, but you should be specific and clear about what you're discussing in your paper and how it supports that thesis. So I, as a reader, should be able to see how you reached your ideas and conclusions. I just talked about this, discussing a different idea that was originally discussed in the beginning of the essay, so stay focused throughout the essay. A lot of informal language. I got a lot of, so as I said earlier, so a lot of unnecessary language that might not be deleted. So as you're editing and revising your paper, you can cut that out. Not saying exactly what you were intending to say. I got a lot of papers that kind of beat around the bush, and it took maybe a whole page for me to figure out what exactly they were saying. Get to your point. What are you saying? Just say what you want to say. Again, this is that point, that question. What are you intending to say? And then just saying that. And it's a lot harder to do than just to say it. So it takes a lot of practice. And also we're not, let me see, other slides here. Keeping your audience in mind. If you've had issues with your thesis statement, we are about to read, and I'm not going to go over this with the full class. I'm going to have you kind of go over it by yourselves. Then how would you respond to your own writing? Okay, read your writing out loud. If your language is difficult to read out loud, then it's probably difficult for your reader to understand. And remind yourself of your thesis, and throughout your essay, keep asking yourself, how is my information relevant to that thesis? Okay, if the answer to the question is my information is not relevant, either delete that information or find a way to make it relevant. Because a lot of times when writing, it also has to do with deleting, because what you might have written originally and you thought it made sense, as you start to kind of reform your essay, it no longer makes sense. Also, if your thesis or argument changes throughout your writing process or your essay, change your initial thesis. So I've read papers where the first paragraph and the rest of the paper don't match. What's easier in that situation, it's not everybody's situation, is to change the first paragraph and to actually change the thesis. Because sometimes as you're writing, your thesis changes, and then go back and change that. And then also have somebody else read your essay. Of course, we do peer review, but you could also go to the OWL online writing lab through the college or something else. So right here I have several different example theses. These are all from previous classes, as I've taught from various colleges, and I kind of copy and pasted directly from other essays. They all are vague in some way. Some at the end are a little bit more specific. But what I want you to kind of do on your own to practice is to ask yourself, if you found this sentence in a peer review, how would you revise it? For this one here on slide 6, in this essay, I will argue that of the particularly egregious points raised by the author Gay. Never write in this essay, I will argue. This is one of those instances where you just want to say what you want to say. I don't actually know what they're talking about here. What are they doing? I don't know. So throughout this, really, kind of, if you have a question, if you want to talk to me about it, please let me know.